Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Groeschel, and I'm your host. This podcast is sponsored by John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education, including my book, Just Tell Them the Power of Explanations and Explicit Teaching. Also important to mention, in addition to John Catt, which you can find all their books in the show notes, is that Steplab is putting on lots of events this year in various cities in the United States in an ongoing manner, including our certificate program, which is online. And in May 2025, we have events in Charlotte, in New York City, and Philadelphia. So if you would go and click into the show notes, you can go check that out and come and get some instructional coaching training and learn how to be an effective coach. I have just such an amazing opportunity today to talk to Ronak Bhatt about his school, a school I have visited and done some training in. It's a very unique school, and I'm just thrilled to bring to you like one of these kind of lighthouse institutions that really are doing a lot of great work for kids. Ronak, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Zach. It's great to be on your show. I've been listening for a long time, and it's quite an honor to be included as one of your guests.
It's kind of funny when the guests come on, they've been listening, and then you kind of get to see what's behind the curtain and see that the wizard, the wizard is just Jeff Goldblum, basically. Um,
The making of the hot dog, right? You don't
yeah,
want to,
yeah,
sometimes you don't want to see it, but
yeah. So I've been to your school. Tell us where it is, what sort of differentiates it from other types of sort of generic schools that most people would be familiar with.
the school is called Telra Institute. It's a charter school in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's a relatively young institution, so we opened our doors in 2021, and we're up to around 650 students now in grades K through 9, and we're expanding one grade each year all the way to 12th grade. So, there's a couple of interesting things about it. One is it's a charter school, so there's some unique facets there just in terms of how schools like that are governed and the relative degrees of freedom that we have as a charter school relative to some district schools or even some private schools. And then the other thing is just what our focus is as a school, right? So if you believe in charter schools, you believe in school choice, which means schools need to have a distinctive identity, a distinctive value proposition, and that's a value proposition both for students as well as staff. And in that regard, what we strive for is providing advanced learning. What do I mean by that? Well, the genesis of Telra is really in this observation that we really don't challenge students as much as many of them deserve to be challenged. We know that people, students, adults alike, tend to rise to the level of expectations you give them. And for many students, especially at the elementary level, they come home from school day after day saying, Mom, Dad, I'm bored. I didn't learn anything in school today. When I started seeing that in my kids, in the kids of a lot of my friends, I tried to approach a solution through my child's teacher, through the principal, through the district school board. I went through all those levels in the general public district system. And I kept hitting walls in terms of what schools were able to do or willing to do. And it was only at that point that I started exploring this concept of charter schools. Myself, I grew up in public schools, and I had never even conceived of a charter school or a private school education for any of my kids. But, I'm a father of four, so this was a big investment if we were going to consider a private school. But it was also really important that my kids enjoy school, that they come home every day feeling challenged, feeling like the 7 hours they just spent was worthwhile. And so as we kind of explored the limitations of what the typical public district system could offer them, it started to look like there were lots of different challenges that possibly could be overcome if we had the freedom to offer a different kind of school. And that was sort of the motivation to providing advanced learning to students, which means taking away a lot of the artificial barriers on and the artificial caps on what they might be allowed to learn at each grade level.
So you sort of are talking about two slightly contentious things. The first is just that there should be options, there should be choices in the school system. It's often thought that doing this takes away resources and good kids from your neighborhood public school. So that's one piece. And I think in a second, we'll talk about what it means to really start a charter in North Carolina. Like, I'm very curious about that process. But then there's this other one, which is that children who are advanced or gifted or whatever other euphemism you have, that they can and should be accelerated when it tends to be in public education. These kids are sort of the last thing on everybody's mind, right? The most important thing is to give interventions to kids that are usually bubble kids, kids that are just on the cusp of maybe passing the test. What are some of your arguments for why advanced learning and why these kids matter too? Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, hopefully the answer is self-evident, right? All kids matter. And as you yourself said, in a lot of school contexts, they're the last ones on everyone's mind. The common attitude is, oh, that child, they're going to succeed no matter what. So, maybe put them in the back of the room, they can read on their own, or they could be a teacher's helper. But either way, you're not designing an educational system or an educational experience that's optimized for that student, right? And we understand, look, in any kind of school, you can't optimize for each individual student, right? We haven't reached this nirvana of purely personalized learning. But to feel like your child is always an afterthought, parents can't tolerate that. So that's one, right? I mean, the other side is I think we all understand that there's very few one size fits all in the world, including the world of education. Let's use an example, right? Some students are extremely into art and they want to go to an artistic high school, study dance, visual arts, whatever. Those students may not be the same students that really want to go to a STEM focused high school or a military focused high school, right? So we understand that there's a need for perhaps magnet schools or private schools, all kinds of different higher education options that cater to these different interests, these different capabilities that really help individuals thrive and make the most of their talents. Those are the same people that go to kindergarten and first and second and third grade. And some of those talents and predilections emerge at an early age. And you can tell sometimes when you have a 3 or 4 year old, this kid might be have a talent for music, and maybe you really want to focus and give them exposure to music, not to the exclusion of all the other opportunities that they could have, but at least giving them the chance to develop that talent. And in the same way, some kids really want to read more deeply or do more advanced math or go extra accelerated in science. And they should have those opportunities just like a child who needs special education should get the support they need.
How do you design for this? Like, what are the logistics, or what is the main mechanism that you use? Because I imagine anyone can kind of opt into this school, and you're going to have different levels right from the start. And some people feel like their child is accelerate should be accelerated, and really they don't learn as fast as a pace as others. And so, what do you do specifically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, and everybody thinks their child is the most beautiful child in the world, of course, right? As they should. And but the fact is, reality has to be accepted at some point. So what we do is we are open enrollment, and we say every student needs to have an opportunity to show that they can thrive here. And we give placement tests, right? So if you let me back up a step, right? If you start from this idea that we want to expose children to a more challenging curriculum and to some degree accelerated, but not necessarily highly accelerated with opportunities for acceleration. So if you start from that point where we're going to have a rigorous curriculum that's at least somewhat accelerated at each level, that one curriculum is still not going to be optimal for any student. So again, if you're not going to this extreme hyper individualization, put every child on a laptop and let them learn at their own pace. And, as a brief aside, technology is improving. There are some really good products out there. And I think people are seeing a lot of success with that kind of approach. That being said, there's something about learning in a community, learning with a real teacher up in front of you who can inspire you, having a group of peers around you who can support you, who can motivate you, who can set examples for you. There is something there that we didn't want to lose, right? So we didn't want to say, you know what, we can just accelerate a child because they can log on to this program at home and be a homeschooled student. There are always going to be some students that do that, but we wanted to see how much of an in-class, in-person experience can we create while also providing these acceleration opportunities and providing a rigorous curriculum. So as soon as you accept the fact that you're going to have a spread of prior readiness levels coming into your class or coming into your school, you have two options, right? You can either say, well, I'm going to differentiate, right? There's that buzzword that I heard a lot about. And the only problem is it is really, really hard. It's a small problem, just almost impossible to do well, right? So, the example we try to use, I think there's been studies that show like in a typical fourth grade classroom, you might have students at kind of 5 or 6 different grade levels, everywhere from like a typical second grade level math or a seventh grade level math, all in a normal school, American school that would all be grouped into a fourth grade class. As a teacher, how do you teach to that? You either you either just pick and say, I'm just going to teach at the fourth grade level, and the kids at the extremes can fend for themselves, or you could say, I'm going to teach at my to help support my weakest students because I need to get them up to grade level. So you focus on those that are at kind of second, third grade level, helping them get up to fourth grade level. And again, the ones that are a little bit more advanced can languish. Or you can say, and what the typical advice is for teachers, well, you just differentiate. So in this case, you might come up with 5 different lessons and break the class into groups and spend 5 or 10 minutes with one group, 5 or 10 minutes with another group. And meanwhile, the rest of the class is kind of on their own. I didn't think any of these were really good solutions to that problem. Because if you fundamentally believe that time with the teacher is valuable, which again, stepping back, I do believe that's valuable. Otherwise, I'd just put my kid on a laptop. If I believe that's valuable, then I don't want that time with the teacher to be divided by 5 because the teacher is working at 5 different groups. The solution to that is to come up with homogeneous grouping. And just a logical conclusion from some of these premises that I started with, but it's one that ironically much of the educational establishment doesn't support. Now, there's a lot of research that seems to support that, and I've heard it on your podcast. I've heard it from those who've worked in direct instruction, and of course, with those who work in any field outside of education, right? We know that homogeneous grouping helps when you put kids of the same tennis level together on the court to coach them in the types of practice that they need to improve, and in music and in any other endeavor. We know that homogeneous grouping is important for the efficiency of teaching and training. So that was sort of the next step. So if I'm trying to achieve homogeneous grouping in my school, I need to find a way to identify students that are at the same level of readiness to learn in either reading or in math. And so we use placement tests, right? We figure out where a child needs to be to teach them in their zone of proximal development. So we do this thing called ZPD placements, and we put that kid into a classroom, an instructional group, as we say, which is not so hard for them that they get frustrated and not so easy for them that they get bored. We want them to be just that level where it's out of their comfort zone. It's a little bit of stress because we know that muscle stress, mental stress, that's how you drive growth. But it challenges them at that level that every day they go home thinking, boy, I had a workout today. I had a mental workout, but I learned something new. And, I didn't get everything, but I knew enough and I'm going to get whatever I missed the next day, or I'm going to read it at home and get it. And that fundamentally is how we achieve higher than normal growth and acceleration that we think all kids are really capable of.
I mean, everybody on the podcast probably at this point knows that I think what you're talking about is awesome and makes a lot of sense. Fortunately, other than in special education settings with homogeneous grouping, I haven't seen it really applied to groups of 600 kids like you do. And it's just really inspiring to me. I'm curious. You mentioned like what you might do. I was thinking if some of these kids are gifted and maybe that's who you attract because they're parents who want to see this acceleration, why don't you do what a lot of people are doing, like project-based learning? Why don't you I know you do use like teach like a champion strategies. Why don't you just kind of use more of a child-centered kind of discovery approach because they're super smart, the argument goes, they can handle it kind of thing.
Well, again, the argument goes that if they're really that independent in learning, they could probably do it on their own. And there are some kids that can just do it on their own, right? To varying degrees. But in other parts of any child's development, right? Maybe they're super motivated in math and they go home and they study math books and they hop online and watch YouTube videos from different sources that teach them math techniques. But maybe on the reading side, they're not quite as independently motivated, right? And so those students, and really most students, need a good deal of structure and firm expectations and a scaffolded approach to learning, right? You need to break it down and tell them step by step, here's what you can do. And now suddenly you've developed this new technique, this new capability for either analyzing a paragraph and marking up the parts of speech or for solving an algebra problem. As you know, the research shows that that sort of explicit instruction, direct instruction, I know there's different nomenclature for it, but that kind of teaching style is strongly evidence-based. And that's what's going to help these students develop from their foundations and lay those foundations so that they can really employ these higher level skills. Now, when they get to high school, and if they've mastered so much of the foundational work, there will be plenty of opportunities to do some more independent project driven work, well, to exercise those skills. But it's a mistake to skip that foundational work and jump right into those projects. I mean, you can come up with kind of pretty sounding projects that maybe make for good parent demonstrations, but I'm always looking to find the most efficient way for children to learn because, look, we have 7 hours or 7.5 hours with the child each day, right? Each moment is precious. I think a lot of us during COVID saw how effectively are we using this time? I mean, I saw my kids doing work from home where all of the work for the school day was done in like an hour and a half. And then they were just kind of left to fend for themselves. So we were sent the message that really the meat of the school day was 90 minutes and the rest of it was fluff. Well, we don't accept that at Telra, right? We want every minute to be meaningful. And that means we want every moment of instruction to be maximally effective for students. And which is not to say we're there yet, right? We're trying to find our way and we're still a relatively young school and we're trying to figure that out. But we do not let any moment languish. And that means a lot of explicit instruction for students, a lot of practice, a lot of supported practice, a lot of explicit guidance.
That's great. I'm just thinking about some, and I know you've seen this online, some of these arguments made by people that they think what you're talking about in terms of the logistics of dividing kids up based on tests and all this, that it's not possible. It's logistically way too challenging. You're going to get a group of only 3 kids in this class, and then you have a group of kids which are so mixed up by age that they are not going to be able to socially interact with kids that are that are like them. It might not be developmentally appropriate or something. And I just keep coming back to all these examples I brought on the podcast of schools that do this. How do you respond to that?
So luckily I come at it from a place of ignorance, right? So I don't have a K-12 background, right? I'm a physicist by training. I spent some time in the business world before coming around to education by necessity because no one else was out there doing what I felt needed to be done and what after all my research showed should be done. If no one else is doing it, you look around and you think, okay, well, I guess I got to do it. So that has its pros and cons. And one of the pros is that I don't have the built-in expectations that certain things can't work just because we've done it a different way all along. So I'm willing to question everything from first principles and say, why can't we group this way? Why can't we run these tests? Why can't we teach in a certain manner? And yes, there are logistical challenges, but they can be overcome. So one of them, for example, is this idea that if I have a bunch of second graders and I give them placement tests and I find high, medium, and low, or 3 levels or 5 levels or 7 levels, whatever it is, in one particular area, let's call it math, those second graders next year are going to become third graders. And I'm going to have now 5 groups of third graders that are going to be largely distinct and then 5 groups of fourth graders. And whoa, I've just recreated tracking, right? And I know there are a lot of strong feelings about tracking. But what happens if instead of focusing on grouping just within grade levels, if you group across grade levels? Now, instead of having a certain set of classes that only the high students attend, you've got a series of instructional groups that every student in the school will progress through. Now, they may be at different ages when they progress through them, but every student progresses through those classes. Every student's going to take the same algebra class. Some kids might take it in seventh grade, some kids might take it in eighth grade, other kids might take it in fourth grade, but they're all going to be mixed together in that same algebra class. So, some of the downsides that people feel from tracking of creating sort of this segregation within the school is entirely eliminated because every child is mixed together and goes through these different, all the same series of classes. And as a result, yes, you do have, age spans of maybe 2, 3, sometimes 4 years, but it's so normalized at our school that nobody thinks twice about it, right? And if you've read the research on acceleration, you know that these fears of children becoming socially maladjusted when they skip a grade are wildly overblown, right? In general, the social outcomes are positive, mostly just neutral. And if you can imagine, if you have a really precocious third grader who's reading at a fifth grade level and they move to fourth grade, they're probably going to actually fit in a little bit better with that group of fourth graders than they might with their third grade, peers that they started with. Now, in our school, we don't generally do whole grade acceleration. We do subject specific acceleration. But even then, our courses aren't labeled as grade level courses in math and English, right? So it's Telra Math 9, for example, which is an intermediate algebra course. And you'll have a mix of grade levels in there. The 9 does not signify a grade level, it's just the ninth in our sequence of courses. And so you break that grade level expectation and you get kids' mindsets out of grade levels from the very beginning when they come in. And so as a result, kids are used to playing with friends of slightly different ages, just like they did, 100 years ago with the one-room schoolhouse, just like they do probably at home when they have friends down the street who are, plus or minus 1, 2, or 3 grade levels. They all get down to the cul-de-sac and play baseball or kickball, right? We were used to this growing up. It's only in K through 12 that you have this really artificial constraint where everyone's the same grade level or everyone's the same age, right? Once you leave education, colleagues at work are probably all different ages and no one thinks twice about it. So, we really have this opportunity to break out of that mindset. Now, we're handcuffed a little bit by state laws, right? We still have to do end of grade testing. So kids have to be classified in certain grade levels for certain bureaucratic purposes. But to within degree of freedom we have, it really doesn't mean much at our school.
Wow, that's really interesting. To what extent do you feel like you are achieving that goal that you originally told me about, which was that you had your kid, they were basically the last thought on that teacher's mind because, or maybe they were given some extra assignment to do at home because they were, just to please the parent. And now you get kids who are going to go through a completely different style of school and education. Do you see kids accelerating through topics much faster? Do you see kids enjoying their learning that perhaps they wouldn't have gotten that experience at a different institution?
Absolutely, right? So on the one hand, I think people often focus on math, right? Just because it's the easiest thing to talk about in acceleration. But, our kids get to enjoy Shakespeare in 1984 and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and they get to experience rich literature. They get to experience fact-based social studies and history classes and science classes. And yes, of course, in math, our kids get to accelerate, and we do balance acceleration with in-depth understanding, right? So we use a curriculum in math called from a publisher called Art of Problem Solving. And it's something that was developed by folks with a really deep mathematical background who have done competition math and really appreciate the beauty of mathematics beyond just kind of the pure utilitarian purpose of passing a grade level test. So our kids do get to go much deeper in math than they would if we were just trying to accelerate them as fast as possible to meet grade level standards, right? So we go to the grade level standards and then some to make sure our kids really appreciate and have that foundation. So if they want to go out and do higher education in a STEM-based field, they're going to have a level of comfort with math that many students wouldn't. And yeah, we get to push the boundaries, right? So our promise is through our grouping model, we're trying to get, 15, 20% more growth every year than would be kind of the national median. And, based on some of our nationally normed tests, we do achieve that number. But some of the funner, more fun, interesting ways that we like to think about, achieving our goals is how many expectations can we break, right? So, for example, our state has a coding system for courses, North Carolina. So, high school math, math one has a certain course code, which is typically a ninth grade class. They extended it so they had a slightly different course code available for middle school students who take that math one freshman year course as middle school students. They did not have a course code for elementary students who took that class. Well, we had a fourth grader a couple of years ago who wanted to take that class. We wanted to give them that high school credit because they earned it. And lo and behold, this next year, the state came out and developed an elementary school course code for Math 1, right? So it's these sorts of little victories that we get behind the scenes to say we can change those expectations of what people think is possible. And it's not just with these like super far out on the tail outlier kids. A lot of kids can achieve this if you give them the opportunity and the support and the expectation that they can do it.
Wow. Yeah, and I know you've tried to convince me to bring my daughter down. I know that it's all the way across the country. We're encouraged to teach our kids to read when they're with us, right? And it's just a bonding exercise. So I mean, I taught my daughter to read not because I thought she was at risk of anything, but because I knew that she would want to be able to have access to books and to be able to read earlier, and it was bonding between us. But now you get into kindergarten and you realize you taught her all the way up into first, perhaps even second grade reading. You realize that the curriculum is probably never again going to challenge her from this point forward because she's has a lot of gifts, but also she got a rich learning environment when she was growing up. And there's nothing really for them, right? And for me as a student, I remember just waiting and waiting for that moment. Is it going to be high school where it gets hard? Is it going to be college when it gets hard? And the wait is too long. I don't know. It's just it takes until you get out of the public school system in a lot of cases.
Well, I mean, have you heard your daughter's teacher say, "Oh, well, don't worry, in a year or two, the rest of the class will catch up to her"? And I don't know if you're supposed to feel good about that response because that seems to imply that, well, we're just going to kind of put your daughter in a holding pattern for a couple of years while everyone else learns, and then she'll get challenged. But that ignores the opportunity cost of, well, she could have been learning these first 2 years, and by the time she's in second grade, maybe she'd be at a fourth grade or a fifth grade level, right? Why are we waiting just to make life easier for teachers? We really should be doing all we can to educate each student and keep them growing every day. That's fundamentally what we're trying to do, and we can do better as an educational system.
Let's talk about charters because I mean, I've talked to you a bunch, and I wouldn't say like the first thing out of your mouth is like advocacy for charter schools, but you did go through the process, and you do now have an opportunity with being able to open a charter that wasn't previously possible or wouldn't ever probably be possible without this system. Maybe speak to this because in my state of Washington, we don't have very many. We have a handful. I think that we're not going to add any more in any time soon. And it's very controversial here. So take me through this. What's the process and what's the rationale you think for this?
So the rationale is really just this belief in pluralism, right? So there are a lot of different opinions on how education should work. So some of these are philosophical differences that we can either be at loggerheads about at every school board meeting and in every elementary school around the country, or we can say, you know what, maybe to each his own, right? And, someone can do a really strict school with uniforms, and someone can do a more project-based learning school, and, everything in between. Um, so that's part of it, right? Just the kind of this American belief that there are many different ways to accomplish something, and let's let people have some autonomy, right? Whether it's parents or teachers or administrators to find what works best for their work style as well as for their student body. So that's part of it in this idea that we need to give parents this opportunity to move away from kind of the educational monopoly, because that also lowers the temperature a little bit, right? Because, otherwise you are going to be continually fighting with other parents about what should be the right direction of your one school option, right? Rather than deciding that you can break that apart. So that is kind of the motivation, right? And I gave a talk sometimes about charter schools, and I use this Louis Brandeis quote, right? So he was in the Supreme Court, and he was the one who came up with this phrase that states are the laboratories of democracy. So I know similarly, charter schools are the laboratories of education because you can give an opportunity at a small scale to try different educational models and see what works. And if it works, then hopefully others can learn from them. I know for a fact that I've learned from some other small charter schools, private schools, aspects of the educational model that I think I've used in forming Telra. So I greatly appreciate that there have been people with much more experience who've come before me. You mentioned Teach Like a Champion. Yeah, we are big users of Teach Like a Champion, and what Doug Lamavda has done to provide a roadmap for school leaders has been fantastic. We greatly appreciate that. But we're also looking at things like what Michaela does in the UK, what Bailey's Academy has done on kind of in the private school sector, and I have actually this notebook full of inspiring schools that includes public schools and magnet schools, and like every now and then I add other schools to that file and just say, hey, that's where I go for ideas, right? Because we can't come up with everything full grown. We've got to steal from the best. So that's part of it. And that's, I think, part of the ecosystem, this marketplace of educational ideas that if charter schools and private schools or micro schools can be part of this, can form this community, it can really accelerate our learning as educators. So I've rambled a bit, right? I don't know if I answered your question, like what's it like to start a charter, but that was sort of the motivation why I think charter schools are important in that educational ecosystem. Tuition free, by the way, right? Because private schools have been out there forever, but we want to give parents a tuition free option to take advantage of something a bit more customizable.
Right, and this episode is proof of this working, this kind of proof of product because previously, we had a Morningside Academy on here, right? But the first thought is, well, that costs $25,000 to go to, right? And also, it has its own context. It's mostly children with ADHD or dyslexia, and what would this be like in a different setting in a different part of the country, if it was free and if it was optional enrollment and so on? And so now you're here, and we can talk. When someone on Twitter says like it's impossible to homogeneously group because it's just logistically a nightmare, it's like, well, there's schools doing it, right? Like it's so that just isn't true. When you went through this process, was it a headache? Was it a political nightmare? Was it a bureaucratic mess? I'm just curious, like the paperwork side of it.
In North Carolina, the process we started in 2019, started by recruiting a nonprofit board, forming a nonprofit, and I'd had some experience in a previous nonprofit I was part of, so I knew how to get that off the ground. Then you quickly run into this idea where you need to prepare a charter application, which is kind of a 150-page document, which is answering some fundamental questions that the state has. There's a template of, what is your school model and how are you going to fund it and how are you going to meet the needs of all children and how are you going to provide school lunch and what's the schedule like and how do you meet 504s and IEPs, and right. So if you are a novice to education, right, I was coming from physics and I taught a little bit at the university level, but all this was just K-12 jargon to me. I had no idea. But, there's a thing out there called the internet and you can research, and that's what I did, right? There was a time to research and learn what the school model was going to be and how you can respond to all these questions in a smart way. And unfortunately, this was before AI. It would have been a lot easier trying to write this now. But back then, I put in the time. It takes time. It takes a lot of reading. It takes a lot of thinking. But, at some point, we hit this point where it was June or July of 2019. The charter had to application, this 100-page document had to be submitted in kind of September. Otherwise, we were going to miss the application cycle. We'd have to be pushed back another year. So I went out and found a charter consultant. There's these ecosystems of consultants and advisors who take, a group of parents or community leaders who have this notion to start a charter school, but no expertise, and they provide them the expertise and they kind of help you get your charter off the ground. So I went and talked to one of them and said, "Hey, look, I have this idea for a charter. I've got a board. Can you help us develop this application?" And they said, "You know what? This is a great idea. We'd be happy to help you. It's going to take about a year. So we can help you get into the 2020 application cycle." And so I went to my board, right? And I went to Dr. Gregory Denley, who's passed away since, but he was founding vice chair and later became the chairman of the board. And I told Greg and I told the rest of the board that, look, this is what the consultant has told us, right? This is really disheartening because we're kind of 6 weeks away and they're saying it's going to take a year. Even though we've kind of done the market research, we know the demand is there. We have the gem of the idea, but to put this whole application together, they're telling us, the experts are saying it's going to take a year. What do we do? And Greg told me, look, Ronak, if you think about the students that we want to serve at Telra Institute, and if one of them came to you with this challenge and said, "I don't know if we can do this," what would you tell them? And at that point, I felt really ashamed because the answer was clear, right? If a student, the kind of student that I want at Telra, had come to me with this question, I would say, "Go for it. Show us what you can do." And so, he shamed me and the rest of the board and just saying like, "Okay, we're going to have to just buckle down and each of us is going to have to contribute and we're going to have to figure out how to get this 150-page document together in the next 6 weeks and apply," even though, they tell us usually schools apply and most of them don't get through in their first application round. They have to apply again next year. We're going to try it. So that was an intense 6 weeks, but we got it in. We then, went through some series of interviews with Department of Public Instruction. Eventually, there was a State Board of Education meeting in March 2020 where they approved us. And they said, "Okay, you're going to have a charter to open in the fall of 2021. Now, there was a little bit of other stuff happening in March of 2020 as well, if you remember, right? I think that was probably the last meeting that the State Board of Education had in person before they just shut down. But we had our approval. So we were able to then go and, through a pandemic, try and recruit teachers and find space and build a curriculum and get desks and chairs and all this stuff that we had to do to get a school off the ground in the fall of 2021. That's what we did. And somewhere along the line, I said, I was the chairman of the board, and I had a job, I had a full-time job. But when I looked at how unique this school model was going to be to actually accomplish our mission, I couldn't find anybody who was going to be able to run it the way we needed to run it and had the background and the willingness to work on our dime, which was pretty minimal, to run this school. And so that's when I said, okay, I'm going to have to quit my job and just take this on full time because, again, looking around, there was no one else available. So, forced into that position, but I'm glad I did because, that was history. And here we are now, 5 years later. And we've grown to over 600 students, and we're about to open our second building. We're building a high school now, so we're off to the races. But that was if Greg had not kind of thrown down the gauntlet for me right there, we might be still waiting for some consultant to put this together for us, and it probably wouldn't have been true to our vision. So I really appreciate what he was able to do. And if we can just do that for our students, right? To light that fire in them and make them believe that they can take this foundation that we're going to establish for them and just go out and do hard things, do things that they think are impossible, but we know they can do it. I mean, then we'll have done our jobs as educators.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I get a chance to come back because Steplab is running an intensive at your school. I know that you use Steplab in the coaching. Tell me about how you believe sort of this intensive is going to help drive your coaching program and kind of what the role of coaching would is in terms of making your school even better than it already is.
Look, on paper, a school could be great, right? You might have a wonderful curriculum, a wonderful schedule, the shiniest new facilities and computers and whatever. But at the end of the day, we know that teachers are going to make or break a school. You've got to have fantastic teachers who know what to do in the classroom, who come prepared and have the skills to be successful in the classroom. And that is not something you can just assume away or just hire and assume that you're going to find somebody who has that talent. And so we've been working over the past few years in laying the conditions, right? So all those other things, we've got facilities, we have what we think is a great curriculum, but we need great teachers and we want the teachers that we have to get even greater. And I think the best way to do that is with really strong professional development and coaching. And when I've looked out there, the model that I've seen that I know you've talked about and I think you introduced us to is Steplab because it provides this integrated model of a huge library of reference materials. And I think teaching videos are a fantastic and underutilized tool because you've got to know what good looks like before you can achieve good. It's structured in a really sensible way, and it provides a platform for feedback, for coaching, and metrics all around to make sure that people are staying on top of it, right? So in one-stop shop, it gives us all these things, right? So we adopted it at the beginning of this year. Our teachers have started to learn how to use it. We have a few administrators who've been, using it heavily as the coaches. But I feel like we've just scratched the surface of how to be effective with both the kind of IT side of it, as well as the interaction between coaches and teachers. So for us to get to the next level, we want our coaches to be the best in the world so that they can help our teachers be the best in the world, right? And we're really excited to be able to host one of those intensives, right? These wizards from across the pond are coming to the East Coast, and we're proud to be one of the locations where they're going to put on a training. And so yeah, we're looking forward to hosting the team in May, and we will be sending several of our staff members through that process. And we're hoping to come out the other side, even stronger. And we understand this isn't something that, as a school, you can just learn how to do overnight. It's a journey, but we're committed to it.
I love it. Yeah. And it's part of your sort of comprehensive approach, right? Just this, there's no sort of silver bullet, right? When it comes to developing, retaining and just ensuring that your staff is really developed to maximize learning for these kids. So I'm so happy to be, even the smallest part of it. I think it's going to be great. I can't wait to say hi to everybody again and see how it's been like a year later. Ronak, before we go, anything else that you wanted to share? Any last words, I guess, and then we're going to close out.
Well, I guess one thing I will share, and I'll just share it because I know you have an audience, and I'd love to get feedback from your audience on this particular concept, right? So 5 years ago, this charter started with a dream, and we were just alone kind of in the wilderness trying to see if this was going to have legs. We're thinking about doing it again, but not in terms of training students, but in terms of training teachers, right? So the idea now is to say we have some sense of what could make a great teacher. What teaching programs out there are generating these teachers where we can hire them into our school or other schools like us and know that they're going to be effective from day one. And gosh, I've struggled. I've gone out and I've talked to you, I've talked to other experts and say, like, point to an undergraduate program where you feel really strongly about the teachers that are coming out of that program, or one of these kind of postgraduate education preparator programs or preparation programs. And everyone draws a blank, unfortunately, right? They keep saying, well, this program used to be good, but I've kind of lost touch. And as a result, we end up finding a lot of teachers that we have to retrain or untrain from some of the kind of educational myths they may have picked up through different sort of programs. And you know what I'm talking about with educational myths, things like, learning styles and stuff that's just it's not evidence-based, and you have to really overcome it to kind of learn how to teach the right way. And so I believe that there is a need for an education preparator. Why is it so hard for me to say that? I don't know. An EPP that teaches teachers the right way based on in cognitive science with aspects of explicit instruction, with aspects of real practical classroom management skills of things like Doug Lemov espouses, so that when a teacher comes out of that program, they actually can be really effective in a classroom on day one. Now, of course, they're going to learn the culture of the school, the curriculum of the school that they eventually teach it. But we think we can really accelerate their development through an EPP like that. So that's a hypothesis. And, I'd love to see what the market thinks about that, right? Because if we create this EPP under Telra's umbrella, it's not just for the benefit of our own teachers that we'd like to send through this program. We'd like to send other teachers through this program as well. And I hope that there are, professionals out there, whether they come from education or they're coming from, a different degree program like, engineering or history or whatever, who could be motivated to come and fill this gap of quality educators that the United States is experiencing. But they just need to find an educational preparation program that is going to be tactical, practical, and targeted to really turn them into teachers and just give them the skills that they need. So I'm curious. I'd love to hear from your listeners, if there's a way that they can, maybe you can in the show notes or something, you can put my contact info or a way that they can give me feedback on, is this something that the market wants? Because we're willing to invest and build that, but we don't want to do it, in a void where it gets no traction. So I feel like I could spend my time on Twitter bemoaning the lack of good programs. And I know, sometimes it's fun to do that and talk about how education is in the dumps and people are on the wrong track. I could have done that, 5 years ago and just, been one of those parents that just complains on Facebook all the time about how their district is on the wrong track. But I didn't. I went and said, okay, I'm going to try and do this the right way, even though it's going to make my hair turn white. And now I think we have an opportunity to do that with an EPP. So I would love to see if there's folks that want to be part of that.
I love that. And that is so great because you're right. It is fun, isn't it, to say the whole root of all of education's problems are is academia or the universities or whatever. And just, can we solve this with this unique opportunity that some states have made to really, solve an upstream problem with really, really great instruction for teachers. I'm looking forward to how this develops. I hope you involve me in some way or another. Ronak, thank you so much for coming on Progressively Incorrect. Listeners, check out the show notes. I'll put in Ronak's contact information and also links to attend the Steplab Intensive that's going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina, Telra Institute. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.